This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Okay, welcome, folks. Here we are again at Core Brain Journal, and you know what's really interesting? I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to this meeting today, this interview with Dr. Robert Melillo. And he is an exemplary guy who has really been out there on the frontier of what works best for all of us. I mean, he's focused a lot on children and children who have been disconnected, lost, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, other neurologic disorders. He's written a number of books. We're going to talk about them today. And we are going to note a download that'll be available that he's put for us, so we can actually put that download out later on in the interview. And we're going to talk a little more about his books, but we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce him to you, then we'll talk about who he is as a person. We'll go on down the road. So Dr. Melillo is one of the most respected specialists in child neurologic disorders in America. He's been helping children overcome learning disabilities for over 20 years. His areas of expertise include autism spectrum disorders. Have you folks heard anything about autism spectrum? Yes. And PDD-NOS, that's pervasive developmental disorder, ADD, ADHD, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, dyslexia, Asperger's, Tourette's, bipolar disorder. All of these, if you're in the field at all, no matter whether you're a child psychiatrist or whether you're a mother with an ASD child, you know that there are biologic answers out there, and it's a great complexity. And what Rob does is he's going to help us pull some of that complexity together. Hey, we only have a half an hour. What are we going to talk about in half an hour? But it's going to be rewarding because he is a guy who can cut to the chase. Bingo. So, Rob, thanks so much for coming on today. We really appreciate having you.
Oh, thank you, Chuck. It's really, it's always great to speak to somebody like you, so positive and, knowledgeable and forward-thinking, so that we can just help people and get the information out.
That's so true. So, tell us a little bit about your personal life. Let's get to who is Rob the guy? What is he doing and where does he live? That sort of thing.
I got to tell you, right now, life is good. My wife and I, we just celebrated our 27th anniversary.
Oh, congratulations.
And we have 3 kids that are wonderful, grown, mostly out of the house. Our youngest one is still in junior in university in Philadelphia. But, in the last few years, my wife is a talented artist and very talented in many different areas, but she's actually been working with me. We've had a TV show for a year out of Philadelphia, and then we did over the last year, we did a radio show called Power Parenting together, where it's a mixture of, my neurology background and my clinical experiences with her experiences as a mother and as a woman who really relates to other women and other mothers, and it's just been great. We've been working together and traveling all over the world. We're leaving next week. I'm doing a lecture in Amsterdam, and
fantastic.
So all over the place. So life is good. I've been, I focus my time on brain balance centers. Whenever there's a new center, I go there and do some education and awareness raising, meet the families and the kids. We have 110 centers across the country.
Oh, right? My gosh. That is so fantastic. We're going to definitely have you tell us more about that later on, because I think as we close, that there are a lot of people that are going to be on this interview, listeners who will be very interested in the details about brain balance. So you were really. I'm sorry.
A lot of my time now is I lecture on an academic level. Mm-hmm. I do research. I head up a research lab, and then I'm also writing. I'm coming out with my on April 5th. I come out with my 5th book in 7 years. So, it's I get to do a whole bunch of other things, and it's a lot of fun and speak with people like you.
Thank you so much. Do you work in Philly downtown? Do you work with Albert Einstein or Hahnemann, or I guess it's not called Hahnemann?
I'm actually I do have a private practice in New York City on Park Avenue.
Oh, okay.
And because I'm actually a New Yorker, we did the show out of Philly because it was local and there was an opportunity there.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But we're actually I live on Long Island, but we have an office in New York as well.
I got you. Thank you so much. Well, that's good to get the location. Now we could picture where you're from. So one of the things I wanted to do is ask you to help us focus on the transformation in your life. What really hit you somewhere along your path? I mean, you are you trained chiropractic doctor, which would be the same thing. I'm a DO, so I know where that's coming from. And of course, we were really on the basis of training focusing on physical medicine rehabilitation.
Right.
But then there's an evolution because you moved into a whole different area and went into the mind. Could you share some of that for us, if you don't mind?
Yeah, it was kind of in school. I really went into chiropractic. As you said, I was an athlete, and I was interested in a sports medicine approach, and chiropractors had helped me my whole life, and so it made sense to me. But when I got to chiropractic school, I really fell in love with neurology. It was my favorite course. And somewhere in my mind, I kind of linked up the idea of kind of a sports medicine rehab approach to neurology. And that was kind of my thinking on it. And then, I was influenced early on, and I started actually taking as soon as I graduated, I enrolled in a diplomate subspecialty course in neurology. I got my diplomate in neurology right out of school. It was another 3 or 4 year specialty, and then I went into another specialty, which was rehab. So I got, I kind of started right from the beginning in my practice with, neurology and rehab, and at that point, that was the 90s, and if you remember, the 90s was called the decade of the brain. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden there was all this really cool brain research coming out that never existed before. And we could see the brain for the first time, in real time because of different imaging, like, CAT scans and fMRIs and SPECT scans. And we could, start to understand what was happening. And there was a kind of a resurgence also in the understanding of how the hemispheres interact and work. And it was a much more dynamic picture happening in the brain that was almost more looking at spatial temporal physics things, and all that I found really exciting and interesting. And really the first almost 10 years of my career, I worked with adults and pain syndromes and different things that were typical for more physical medicine. But as I'm sure you noticed, when people came in, if they had car accidents or they had headaches or they had vertigo or dizziness or neck pain or back pain, they often complained of psychological issues as well, right? Like depression or anxiety, and then attention problems and all of these different issues. And after a while, you realize, hey, maybe this isn't coincidental. And you realize that, the nervous system is involved and ultimately the brain's involved. But what really kind of got me going was, I was also a young parent. I had 3 young kids, and I had more people coming in talking about their children with ADHD, and I did work with children as well, but all of a sudden, in the early 90s, there was this increase, and one of my neighbors came to me and asked me if her son had ADHD, very severe, and she had started a parent-teacher peer group type of thing that was support group. And she said she was being approached by all these people that said they had different approaches. At that point, she was following the CHAD type of thing where it was just medication and behavior. But she was saying, nutritionists and chiropractors and osteopaths and OTs and vision therapists and all these different people were coming to her saying they could help. And she knew my background in neurology. I started teaching clinical neurology and rehab in the early 90s as well, and I started doing brain research then. So I knew a lot about it, and she asked me, what I knew about ADHD, and I said, I really don't know a lot. She said, well, will you look into it for me because I trust you, and tell me if these other things can help. So a couple of things happened at that point. One is I found a statistic. I started doing research on it and found a statistic. This was 1995, that the use of Ritalin in the United States had increased 250% from 1990 to 95, and nobody knew why. And then the other thing was my son, my older son, his teachers were saying that they thought he might have some attentional issues as well. So now it was, a personal and a professional thing for me.
Yes.
And I started, really looking at what was going on, and being, having a rehab and neurology background, my instinct was, just point to me, show me what's wrong with the brain and let me try to fix it, right? That's kind of like the rehab, physical medicine type thing. Just let me get my hands on it and fix it, right? Mm-hmm. And when I went out and I spoke to a lot of my friends, we all have colleagues, right, that pediatricians, pediatric neurologists, neuropsychologists, psychologists, and I went out to them and I all said, hey, what is ADHD in the brain? What's happening? And they all said the same thing. They said, I don't know. Nobody knows. And I said, what do you mean nobody knows? I mean, this is really becoming a big problem, and we're medicating kids and we have no idea what the problem is. And, as a professional, as an early brain researcher, and as a parent, I wasn't satisfied with that answer. So, I decided to look into it myself. And the first thing I wanted to do was see, is this a real problem? Maybe it's just one of those fads that come along and I had a bunch of teachers that I treated, and one in particular that I really trusted. And I said to her, this ADHD thing, is it a real problem, or is it just like one of those things that we're just recognizing it more? And she looked at me and she said, no, you have no idea. She said, I teach fourth grade and I'm in an elementary school. At lunchtime, if you remember, Chuck, back then at lunchtime, the nurses had to give out the Ritalin.
That's right. And
she said that 50% of her student body was online at lunchtime to get their pill.
Yeah.
And I said, 50%? This was 95. And then she turned me on to a bunch of different books and, that had been written. But she convinced me that this was a real problem. And and she even told me that, she said, this is the next epidemic. And so she kind of, clued me in on it. So I said to her, why? Why is this happening? She said, I don't know, but it has something to do with kids don't move their big muscles anymore. They don't play in the playground anymore. And so that was something that resonated with me again as somebody in physical medicine. And I went, okay, this is really intriguing. Yes. And that's kind of what started the whole journey for me from there. And then it was a matter of just trying to figure out. I connected with some other people that were doing some really cool research, and then just started experimenting with all different types of things. I really believed that we had come up with the answer as far as what is ADHD, and then found that whatever's happening in ADHD really is the same problem in autism and dyslexia and OCD and ODD, and that they're all really variations of the same problem, which is really known as a functional disconnection or a problem with functional connectivity in the brain. And that's kind of, been a really cool journey understanding that.
Well, it's so true. I mean, I'm listening to you. I'm taking the same trip with you, because I remember when I was younger myself, and that's what it was. It was immediate release medication. And one of the reasons, of course, we got into this is because there were instances of individuals who had no executive function.
Right.
They didn't have the executive function, and what happened was people were lost as to what to do about it. That's why they couldn't explain anything, because all they could do is see it. External appearances, something's happened, I can see it, but I have no idea what's going on. And God bless you, buddy, for going deeper and really digging into it and saying, here's some other answers we need to explore.
Well, I think, as you say, it's really interesting, because this is, I think, what really intrigued me with this is because, I also love physics. I love quantum mechanics and all that type of thing, and evolution. And this, to try to figure out, this has really been a journey that's been a lot of fun. It's been trying to figure out like a mystery, And the thing is, like you said, the interesting thing is when you look at the brains of individuals with any of these issues, they look relatively normal. There is no damage, there's no injury, and that's the thing. That's why even today, whenever I do a lecture, and I lecture over 1,000 hours a year, and every type of audience, from parents to PhDs to, MDs, DCs, whatever. The first question I always ask, even today, is the same question I first asked myself, which was, what is actually happening in the brain? I stand up and I say, who in this audience could stand up and tell me what you know about what is actually happening in the brain of ADHD or autism or dyslexia? And I say, just raise your hand if you feel you can stand up and give a pretty good answer. And what happens is, in every audience, Chuck, I mean everywhere, nobody raises their hand. And then I say, okay, who couldn't answer that question? And everybody raises their hand. Even today, the majority of people working with these issues have no idea what the problem actually is.
That is so true.
And that's the problem.
And that is the reason for us to have this conversation.
Right.
And it's the reason you do, what I do, and it's the reason for colleagues to get together and say, let's pull the covers back. We got to stop talking about appearances, and we got to get down to the biology. But sorry to interrupt you, but it's so true.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
So then the question would be, then how did you actually get into that next level of illumination? What was the next thing that lit up your fire that you could say, okay, wow, this is something we need to think about?
Well, at the time, like I said, in the 90s, it was we were starting to learn more about the brain in real time, what was actually happening, how the brain worked, and how it, the way the brain really connects and, develops memories and learns and, develops thoughts is really through timing and coordination and synchronization more than actual physical connections. And so the dynamic aspects of the brain really became more illuminated and really were fascinating. So the understanding that there are timing imbalances, and this opened up a whole nother way of looking at the hemispheres and how the hemispheres work with one another. And so, as you know, a lot in chiropractic and osteopathy, the core of it is about balance, right? Like you have a problem with back pain or neck pain or headaches, ultimately it comes out to an imbalance. And so imbalances were something that I felt comfortable with. And so the idea and the concepts were starting to be, talked about imbalances within the hemispheres as being a causative factor in all different types of psychopathology and neurobehavioral issues and, even physical and immune issues. So true. So I really became fascinated with that and started looking at it. And so, like I said, I started looking at, and we were even using it and teaching this as a rehab model. And so when I started looking into kids and looking at ADHD and trying to figure out what it was, I knew a lot about right and left brain and what they did. And I started reading. And one of the things that stood out from the beginning and stands out even now is that everybody talks about, in all of these disorders, an unevenness of skills, meaning that, these kids aren't bad at everything. And in fact, what usually happens is that they're really delayed and they struggle in certain skills, but they're exceptional in other skills. Even, in autism, you get these savant level skills, right? Yes. And the earliest research, even on dyslexia, two guys, Galiberta and Gershwin, if you ever heard of them, very famous in the area of child development and dyslexia. From the very beginning, they found that there was a physical imbalance, and there was this imbalance in this unevenness of skills where these people couldn't read, but they had exceptional visual spatial skills. So, in ADHD, it was the opposite. They had saw all these skills that they were exceptional at were left brain skills, and all the skills that they struggled with were right brain skills. So I started looking at this, and we were talking about and starting to use this hemispheric imbalance idea from a rehab thinking, and talking about pain and things like that. And then I started looking at this, and I said, wow, is it possible that this this is an imbalance, that what's actually happening in the brain. And then I read about dyslexia and read these guys talking about how it was the opposite, where the right brain was really developed and the left brain was delayed. And then I went to different conferences and they were talking about autism as, all these super skills. And no one really understood why there was this unevenness, but they knew that it was a critical factor, but they didn't know why. It's kind of like everybody knows bipedalism was important for the brain, but nobody can figure out exactly why, right?
It's so true.
And so that was kind of like an aha moment where it hit me and I went, wow. And then I started looking at autism and I saw that there were all these right brain deficits, and everything that they were great in was left brain, and OCD and Tourette's. And then there was all this comorbidity where they were always found together with one another. Like
so
80% of kids with ADHD have at least one other diagnosis, usually OCD or Tourette's. Every kid with autism has tics, has some sort of stims, and have attentional problems. And so they always come together in combination. And so, kind of realize, well, this isn't a coincidence. And when you understand really the way the basal ganglia works and the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex and how it all interacts, you really understand that. But it kind of hit me and I went, wow, is it as simple as that this imbalance is the actual problem? And nobody was really looking at that yet. Mm-hmm. And I said, if that's the case and there's really no damage and there's just this kind of dynamic imbalance, then creating a balance is something that becomes possible. And if I can figure out how to do that, then maybe I can figure out how to resolve or dramatically improve these issues. And that was like a big, big moment for me. And then it was really about, okay, now what tools do I use and how do I do that? And how do I activate different areas of the brain? And went around and just met with different people doing really neat things and started to just put it all together and experiment with it right from the beginning. Got great results.
That is so interesting. We haven't really met before. And as you're talking, I'm thinking how parallel we are. I mean, you're way ahead of me in terms of brain balance in certain respects, but I know that we're the same on the physics and the timing and synchronicity. I don't know if you have read Alfred Korsybski, Science and Sanity, but it's a favorite of mine. Yes. And that one is everything you're talking about is sort of anti-reductionistic thinking. How do we actually look at the complexity and how it's integrated, and then how do we identify where it's a little off and disconnected, and what do we actually do about it? It's got to have a complex answer. It can't be a cookie cutter solution. Right.
No, it's got to be individualized. It's got to be, and that really was the kind of like what I call the black box question was, how do you individualize it? But right from the very beginning, Chuck, I kind of, because of that teacher and because of my own experiences, I really saw that this epidemic. I saw like a tsunami coming. I couldn't have predicted how big it was or is. I mean, going from 1 in 10,000 to now 1 in 67 or 1 in 42 boys in the United States in 3 decades. Nobody saw that coming to that level, but I did see it coming. And, with that, there was a, kind of a sense of urgency. And it was, really looking at, what's going to be the impact of this down the road and what can we do about it? And reading everything, and it just really, all come together. But, it's a problem that, still exists and is still growing.
Well, I'm going to ask you, Rob, a very complex question now. So what you've stimulated our listeners, and many of our listeners are going to be thinking exactly the way you're thinking as well. But down the next level is you've defined the problem. And this is going to be a challenge. Can you say in a few minutes, and this is an encouragement to be somewhat reductionistic, and I apologize, but what kinds of things do you do in brain balance that address the complexity effectively?
Right. Well, I think I have a friend and a colleague named Lou Casalino. If you know who he is, he's a psychologist. He's out of Harvard, and he started a program at Pepperdine he's written a number of great books. One book in particular called the Neuroscience of Psychotherapy. And he has a definition when he talks about psychopathology. He basically says that the primary problem is that when you look at networks that are important in the brain, basically underdevelopment, under-regulation, and under-integration of networks in the brain is really the core of every psychopathology or everything that people come to see us about, right?
So true. So true.
The idea is, okay, so there are these networks, and the networks are connected to localized functions, and there's a lateralized function that's different right and left to a certain extent. So the idea is what I learned from really assessing all these kids in the beginning and even now is that it's about measuring function. Rehab at that time, there was a concept in rehab called functional restoration, which was the idea of using functional measurements in rehab. And then that was carried forward with functional medicine, which was the idea of measuring functions, not just relying on symptoms, but measuring functions and knowing what norms were out there. And so I applied that into I started an organization called Functional Neurology, which is where it's about measuring neurological function in all areas of brain function. So it was about, you don't know what you're going to find. Everybody's going to have a difference. So there may be a right hemisphere delay with left hemisphere strengths, but the makeup of that right hemisphere delay is different. There are hundreds of different centers that control motor function, that control sensory processing and sensory detection and cognitive function and executive function and, spatial awareness and, the way it regulates the immune system and the digestive system and the endocrine system. And so the makeup of all of the different areas in the brain that are, lower or underdeveloped, along with the strengths, because really both of those produce symptoms, right? Like if the right brain is delayed, we have maybe poor focused attention, we have poor spatial ability, we have poor nonverbal communication, so we can't really read other people, we don't form relationships very well, we may not have empathy, or we may not be able to understand other people's thoughts or emotions. And on the other hand, the left brain is more dopaminergic, the left brain is more motor driven, so they may be physically hyperactive. We know that the left brain may generate more, it's more impulsive, it's more compulsive, it likes familiarity, it likes to do the same thing over and over and over again, it likes patterns. The left brain is more about details. So you find that in ADHD or autism or OCD, you get basically poor attention, poor nonverbal communication, poor social ability and emotional regulation, spatial awareness, gross motor movement, but you have hypermotor activity, you have, obsessiveness, compulsiveness, you have focused attention to detail, too much to detail. They get stuck in it. They like familiarity. They can't transition. Anger is generated by the left side of the brain, normally suppressed by the right. So you see that it's a combination of two strong skills from the left along with two weak skills or underdeveloped skills on the right. And all of that comes together to really produce what we call ADHD or Asperger's or autism. And so it's a matter of measuring the strengths and weaknesses. And so we do, like in Brain Balance, we'll do like 1,000 different functional measurements. We look at 120 different academic measurements in grade levels from, pre-K to college level. And, just that alone, the variability in everybody is different, right? Nobody's going to have the same strengths and weaknesses in 120, different academic areas in 12, 13 grade levels. And then you look at motor skills, and then you look at sensory processing, and then you look at, behavior, and then you start looking at immune responses and food sensitivities and vitamin and mineral deficiencies, and you start combining all of that together, and you understand the picture, and then you can put together what you need to do comprehensively to deal with the problem. And that's really been my approach.
That is so interesting. I mean, I knew about it, but you just explained it so clearly and so well. And that whole synchrony, I've been working with it from a point of view of the whole thing to me that's amazing from a more superficial point of view is that we don't deal with context or time in the current diagnostic coding system. And everything you've been talking about is reality, context, and time. That makes the entire diagnostic coding system dark ages. It's just like it's so far way out, and that's why everybody is board certified in psychiatry, because everybody, it's how you look is who you are, you know. And so what happens is you just talked very emphatically and very interestingly. So what you do is you may take a sensory input in a certain context, and what I think you're saying is that you then do something to actually address that, so that it then winds its way into the complexity. Is that correct?
Yeah, essentially, you know, what we're looking at, and I think what most people agree is that most of these problems are developmental, meaning that there's not an injury or damage, but rather there's a developmental imbalance where, you know, somewhere along the trajectory, the developmental trajectory has been thrown off. So that if a child, let's say, you know, is in 5th grade, they should be doing skills at around the 5th grade level, right? Give or take a grade. But if they're doing skills at a 1st grade level, when they're in 5th grade, that's a problem. Now, what is the problem? The problem is just that their brain is really only reached the age of a 1st grader in that particular skill. So it could be in word reading, or it could be in decoding, it could be in spelling. And there are different networks in different areas of the brain that control all of those functions. It could be in nonverbal communication. It could be, you know, in, you know, motor skills. It could be in motivational skills. It could be in the way that they, you know, govern their social development. So what we see is that there are areas of the brain that are delayed in their development, and they're not injured, they're not broken, they're just kind of stuck. They're just slow. And so what we do is identify what level they're at. So if they should be at 5th grade reading, you know, word reading or reading comprehension, which are different sides of the brain. So what we look at is say, okay, if they have, you know, 5th grade, they should be at 5th grade, they're at 1st grade, we're going to train that word reading, but we're not going to do it alone. This is the problem, is that, you know, obviously if a child's dyslexic, in the past, everybody's been, well, let's just, you know, work on their brain. The reading part is the end result, the executive function, the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex. The problem is way downstream developmentally in their foundations of that. And also, no child just has one problem. They don't just have a reading problem. They also have motor problems and sensory problems and digestive problems and immune problems and hormone imbalances. They all have a combination of multiple things. So you can't just work on the reading without working on all of those other skills as well.
Absolutely.
And that's the mistake. And I think that's the one thing that I added that was unique that nobody had really done to that degree, was to really say, listen, we have to identify all of the weaknesses, and we have to try to stimulate all of them, and we have to get all of them to match the strengths as closely as possible. And when we do, then we, you know, because the idea of functional disconnection is that there's no damage, the white matter isn't broken, the gray matter isn't broken, but communication between areas of the brain is broken somehow. They just can't communicate. And the difference is really that there are just different levels of maturity, different levels of activity, different processing speeds, and they're just not compatible with one another, and we need to make them compatible.
Well, you know, Rob, what's so wonderful about what you're talking about, it's really, you're speaking from a point of view of real optimism. You know, that we can measure these things. I think this is what's really interesting to me, and one of the reasons I really love talking to a guy like you, because when we can measure it, we can understand how that complexity actually fits together, as opposed to just looking at it superficially and being puzzled and calling it a name and oh well. But when you start looking down here at immunoglobulin G, or you look at Candida, or, you know, the variety of things that can affect brain function, then you're in a completely different land. I mean, you've gone into a different language pattern, and that's why it's so important for us and listeners to hear a person like yourself introduce them to this other concept, this other language that exists pervasively out there, but the public does not know about it. And
right.
And so I really appreciate you coming on, because this is so interesting. So
well, the other major concept, I think, in that vein of what you just said, that is the concept of epigenetics, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. Which another thing is that I found that when I first started looking at this, a lot of my colleagues, a lot of teachers said, well, these are genetic mutations. There's nothing you can do about them anyway. And so I said, well, where's the genetic mutation? Who's identified that? And 25 years, 95% of the research dollars have been looking for the bad mutation, and we haven't found it. So the idea of epigenetics, that environmental factors can turn off gene expression, but that can be turned back on. So the idea that these are genetic disorders and there's nothing you can do about them, we know is wrong. And so that is another big thing of why I'm hopeful and why I'm optimistic, because there isn't any damage in the brain. There isn't any pathology. There isn't, for the most part, any gene mutation. So why can't we get these things better? Why can't we fix them? There's nothing I can see holding us back. So we should all be optimistic, I think.
Oh, it's so true. I mean, and I so appreciate the way you summarize it so well. I mean, Bill Walsh would totally agree with you. He's, I don't know if you know Dr. Walsh outside of Chicago, but he's just such a interesting individual who's on the theme of epigenetic change and what you can do about it on a molecular level.
Right.
We don't need to just keep throwing meds. Meds help from the point of view they do something on the synaptic level, but if you can get down to the molecular level and really measure that and correct it, then you're in a completely different world. And I think that's one of the reasons there's some resistance, because it's really complex. It is difficult. And it's like taking a big jump off of a big cliff, because you have to go and spend some time. You spent years on this.
Yeah, it's very complex, but yet, we can simplify it, I think, in the idea that, my third book was on really talking about what causes autism. It's called Autism, the Scientific Truth. I think you'd really like it a lot. But it's about looking at, can we prevent these things preconception by identifying the environmental risk factors? And I spoke with a lot of the top epidemiologists and read everything I could get my hands on. And the bottom line is that most people feel this epidemic of autism, ADHD, all of these issues really come down mostly to lifestyle issues, that the same things that's driving a diabetes epidemic and an obesity epidemic and a cardiovascular epidemic are the same factors that are driving these issues in developmental, which really is, lack of physical activity, sedentary behavior, addiction to technology, less and less physical movement, less healthy food, not fresh food, processed foods, in stress and inflammation in our bodies and in our diets, all of those factors. And so those are the environmental factors that are also driving epigenetics. Yeah. And that are causing, problems. So even though it's, understanding epigenetics on a molecular level is complex, as you say, the fact is there are probably simple lifestyle changes that we can do that can alter our gene expression in huge ways and really change everything. And that's kind of also a lot of my approach, is that what we're doing is in using environmental stimuli and changes in lifestyle and management, like reducing screen time, to make changes. And I believe we're making changes on an epigenetic level as well as a physical, chemical, and functional level.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to have a link to that book. I wrote it down while you were talking about it. No, I'm not familiar with it. And then your most recent book is The Disconnected Kids, the Nutrition Plan.
Right.
And you're in that book really saying very specific ideas and specific plans that can actually take place that could, even if you are just in an elementary level of understanding it, applied in the food that you eat every day.
Exactly. I mean, just that's why I think, just going from processed foods to organic foods alters our gene expression. This is like a concept that obviously even 5 years ago would have been like blasphemous, right? Yeah. But now people are talking about it, and it's really fascinating to think about that. Like, people wouldn't think like my food can change my genes.
Oh yeah.
But listen, everything you do can alter your gene expression, and it's one thing when we think about ourselves, and one of the reasons why I like working with kids is because adults, trying to get them to change. I remember somebody told me, trying to get someone to change their diet, it's easier to get them to change their religion. But when you're working with kids, the parents will do what they need to do. If you say, changing your diet will change your genes, adults will go, all right, well, big deal. But if you say, listen, it'll change your children's genes and the way they grow and develop, now they're paying attention, and now they're going to do something about it,
That is so excellent point. I'm looking at the time. Unfortunately, Rob, we do have to wind up. I'm going to tell our listeners that at corebrainjournal.com/010 download, you folks will be able to download a PDF that Rob has shared with us about a number of these topics, and you just be able to pull it right down. I'll have the links to his books in the show notes as well. And so in closing, tell us, please, Rob, what you would like, in closing, where you would like to send people, and if they're going to chase you down and think about you in some other ways, where do you want them to go?
Well, two places. There's my website, drrobertmelillo.com, and on that, anywhere that I'm going to be lecturing or speaking, like you said, I have a course called the Melillo 7-Day Challenge, which teaches them about the importance of developmental milestones and primitive reflexes, and it's a free program that they can do that's pretty neat. So that's where they can kind of connect with me personally. But if they want to learn more about brain balance, they go to brainbalancecenters.com. If I do see patients, so if they want to actually see me in person, they can again contact me through my website. But if they have a child that has a developmental issue, I really suggest that they read the book Disconnected Kids to start, and just see if that makes sense to them. And if it does, then they can, go to the website and find out more about our centers, or the books are all meant to be tools that they can use at home themselves. And I get letters every week from around the world of people telling me that the books alone have changed their lives. So they can start there.
This was so, pardon me for interrupting, but that's what's so refreshing about your work, because you take it down to the street level. You're really helping people in the reality of their daily lives, and really that's an extremely important effort that you've made there. And so I'm going to have the links. I've been taking notes while Rob is talking to us, and I'm going to have links to his books, so you won't have to search around for them. Boom, you just click on them in the show notes. Thank you very much, Rob, for taking the time with us today. I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate your sharing the details, and look forward to having you back sometime in the future.
I would love to. This was a lot of fun. You're a great interviewer, and I'd love to talk more about you and what you do, and because I know it's fascinating. So thank you so much for having me on, and I hope we get to do this again soon.
We will. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.